So this is going to be about being sober curious, which is also going to be kind of tied in with mental health. Oh, now it's not gonna, oh, there we go. So I wanted to define what sober curious means because I I think it's important to state that since being sober curious, it's not, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off. So instead of being, either all or nothing, this kind of allows a little flexibility for people who are curious, want to get their toes wet and kind of explore. So my definition of sober curious means that you are curious and reflecting on your relationship with sobriety. This looks different for each individual, and this is a great opportunity to challenge yourself and to learn more self-awareness, dig deeper into your triggers and traumas, unlearn old behaviors, to develop new tool set for managing stress and learning to work through issues versus numbing and avoiding. Uh, I think for me on my personal journey of getting alcohol removed from my life, um, it wasn't like a switch where, so I didn't just decide, one day to not drink, which of course I did, but it took a lot of building up to that. It took years of taking breaks and exploring my relationship with alcohol in order to take that official plunge, if that makes sense. I always like to bring up this book by Russell Brand. It's called Recovery. And I personally like Russell Brand, his writing style, because he cusses a lot. He seems a lot more real to me. He does kind of build off the foundations of AA, but he kind of tears it apart and reconstructs it in a more modern way. And for me, what feels more relatable. And what I like about Russell Brand is that he also, uh, again, it's just a lot more real. And he points out the fact that addiction isn't just with alcohol. Everybody has some type of addiction, whether it's the internet or sex or gambling, alcohol, even behavioral addictions. There's a lot of different things to consider. And if you look at his book cover, you can see on there drama, texting, chocolate, caffeine, smoking, Instagram, gambling, sex, sugar, alcohol, and all of these different things. So I wanted to share a quote from his book. The instinct that drives compulsion is universal. It is an attempt to solve the problem of disconnection, alienation, tepid despair. The problem is ultimately being human in an environment that is curiously ill equipped for dealing with the challenges that it entails. Uh, this is another quote from the book that I wanted to share because something that I've always struggled with in the past was forgiving myself. Yes, people made mistakes, but that's what humans do, and I am under no obligation to hoard these errors and allow them to clutter my perception of the present. So I personally like this quote because I feel like a lot of times we can get in our own way, whether it's a personal forgiveness or forgiveness of others. Um, and forgiveness isn't always doesn't mean you just accept it and move on. It's more or less a personal thing to take that attachment and detach and not let it control or, like Russell Brand says, clutter your life. So I wanted to also bring up challenges with sobriety. Uh, Obviously, there's a lot because our culture really, really, uh, we drink a lot in this culture. Uh, so some challenges I feel are events, networking, holidays, celebrations, toast, grief, and stress. These are normal triggers that, can, again, in our society, draw us to drink or celebrate or whatever substance of your choice. Um, Obviously, this is holiday season, so going out to holiday parties and celebrations can be really tough, especially New Year's Eve. We have toasts. It's centered around alcohol, and that's something that is important to be mindful of. because if you are not, you're going to be challenged. And you're going to have those moments where, you might decide you don't want to drink, you don't want to participate in that, but here you are at a holiday event and someone's pouring you a glass of champagne for a toast, or, you're being offered, like everyone's getting lit. It's just how it is. So it's important to be prepared in order to deal with those type of challenges and think of that future situation and how you're going to handle it. If you don't, when you're presented with that challenge and someone goes to pour you a drink, then you're going to be on the spot. And sometimes out of the pressure or habit, you might accept it when you're really trying to avoid it. So it's good to be mindful of that and be prepared so that you know exactly what you plan to do should that be something that's in your face. Another challenge is your environment, current lifestyle, and your circle of friends. This is hard for many people to admit and understand or really face, because our circle of friends are, sometimes they're people that have been our ride or die or with us forever, and it's hard to shift when your circle of friends are not. It's also difficult to shift when your current lifestyle um, really is aligned or wrapped around whatever substance or alcohol, because if that's the case, it's going to be very challenging, as well as your environment. So it's important to change your environment and lifestyle to fit the new norm that you want. And also sometimes that includes your circle of friends, which again, this is tough for many people, but if your circle of friends live in the bar, it's going to be very, very challenging to get the support and to shift away from that. So it's something to consider. Um, Something I always try to remind myself is birds of a feather flock together. So if you're around a bunch of people and that's your lifestyle, like I said, that it's at the bar drinking, it's something, it's an opportunity to change that. And so the friendship thing is definitely going to be a big challenge. I know for me personally, you definitely go through an isolation period. And for me, that, a lot of people have a difficult time and want to go back because they're lonely. And I could relate to that as well. But it's kind of part of the process, that isolation period. And so I always recommend taking advantage of that and kind of dating yourself, hanging out with yourself, finding a new ritual, finding ways to elevate, finding ways to explore new things that are exciting to you, because it's almost like having to create a new identity for yourself. You're starting over in a way. It's almost like a rebirth. And so you have to navigate that and play around with that. So you might, it's a great opportunity also for learning new finding new hobbies and interests, and really kind of figuring out who you are without being tied to alcohol. And again, for me personally, I wanted to break the cycle of, that being my memories being blurry and the same thing, the same place with the same people, the same conversations. And I wanted to have more adventure in my life. And, so it can be challenging, especially if you're someone who doesn't like to go and do things alone. But again, it was a really great time for me to explore that. Next is making the initial change and sticking with it. That's a huge challenge because again, we're breaking habits and creating new ones. So that's definitely something to consider if you're playing around with your sobriety. Next is replacing and changing the ways you cope and celebrate. So again, if you're going to not celebrate or cope in the ways that you used to, you're going to have to replace that with new ways. So if you used to celebrate by drinking, or say something traumatic happened or stressful and your go-to is to, pick up beer or do some shots, you're going to have to replace those. So for me, it was having more adventure in my life and more hobbies and traveling, um, finding new rituals and new nighttime ways to calm down and relax and unwind, and new ways to celebrate. And so it's really important to keep all of these things in mind, because you will be surrounded by challenges. And lastly, it's the lack of support of like-minded friends. So again, it kind of goes back to your environment and your lifestyle and circle of friends. It's important to be aware of the lack of support that you may have, and also the lack of like-minded friends. An example of this for me is one of the times where I had stopped drinking before I fully quit drinking. I, I worked in the bar scene. I had a lot of friends in the bar scene, and, I would go out, and I had a difficult time people not caring about my sobriety or my, me wanting to dive into that, and instead just trying to force shots at towards me, or I noticed it was a huge, huge challenge, which again kind of goes back to why you have to isolate and pull yourself out of that situation until you feel strong enough and confident enough to be back in that environment and being able to say no and be true to yourself and your wants and needs without self-abandoning. So that's very important to consider because, like I said, it's a lot of pressure. One of the many ways I had dealt with that at the time, since I was still in that type of environment, was just getting a fake drink, like a soda water with a splash of crayon and a lime, and pretending I had one so people left me alone because my boundaries weren't being respected. Eventually, I got out of that environment, but these are little things to consider. So I also want to do a little quick just about me, who and why. My name is Misty, which I the reason why I've decided to start sharing my sobriety is because I see a huge need in the community. I have been sober for 6.5 years. Next year, I'll be creeping on 7 years of sobriety. I think it's important to also mention that sobriety is going to be different for each person. Now, I am a cannabis user. I have my medical card. So in some perspectives, that might not be considered as sobriety. For me, sobriety is that I'm alcohol free. I don't have substance abuse issues. I did drink a lot of alcohol. That I did have alcohol abuse issues. So that's my version of sobriety. So it's important to keep that in mind, that everyone's version of sobriety will be different. I know in this community, there can sometimes be some harsh rules or judgments in that. And so that's why it's also important to find your crew. So I have a bachelor's in biomedical science with a focus in biotechnology. I also have taken a lot of classes in psychology. Um, I am a rare disease and mental health advocate, and alcohol has negatively impacted my entire life. I grew up with an alcoholic father. Alcoholism runs rampant in my family, and that is inevitably how I lost my dad a couple years ago. I also want to share statistics because I'm a science nerd, and because of my bachelor's, I think it's important to share the reality of everything. And I pulled these statistics from the recoveryvillage.com. If you go to that website, you can get further in-depth information on where these statistics were pulled from. These were the more recent statistics. So I want to start by sharing that heavy drinkers are at high risk for other common health complications compared to moderate or light. I think that's important also because I don't think a lot of people think about the effect that alcohol has on our health. 85% are more likely to be depressed. So that's an important one to point out because I've already struggled with depression my whole life. So drinking, for me, it made my depression much worse. And it's something to consider if you also struggle with depression. Having a depressant in your life on top of depression is only going to just make things a little worse or a lot worse, depends. 61% are more likely to have a weakened immune system. So again, important to realize that drinking alcohol, being a heavy drinker, is going to lower your immune system. If your immune system is chronically low, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a cold all the time. It can also make you more susceptible to cancer, which is 48% more likely to have, and then a whopping 73% more likely to have seizures. I personally know many people who have succumbed to having seizures from alcoholism. Next, I wanted to share the statistics that per day, 29 individuals die from motor vehicle accidents involving a driver impaired by alcohol. That's alcohol-related deaths made up nearly 1/3 of all traffic-related deaths in 2016. Keep in mind, these are from 2016. I imagine, actually, I know for a fact that the statistics since COVID have drastically increased. So these are probably grotesquely under. In 2016, 1 million drivers were arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. Every year, alcohol-related motor vehicle accidents cost the United States $44 billion. So now what, now that we have all this information, I think it's important to ask, what do you do next? Because that's something that I think that's the hardest part, really. Number one, get curious about your relationship with alcohol and substances and polysubstance use. I think it's important to start asking yourself these questions. When you do start asking yourself these type of questions, I think that's the first initial step. For me, when I started thinking about my relationship with alcohol, I started connecting that it affected my health, it affected my mental health, it affected my body, and I started really noticing these things. And that was the first step. Number two, increase your awareness of use and habits. Again, I also started to be more aware of how intertwined in my life it was. I noticed the habits that I had created in time, such as getting off of work and having, starting my first drink, and where that would lead to. I started noticing that friends would come over with a bottle of wine. I started being more aware of how often alcohol was in the picture, where I didn't really think of it before. So you don't really think it's an issue or perhaps even a problem when you're not aware. So the next is building a support system. It's important to build a support system. You're going to start out being kind of isolated and on your own. So in time, you want to start looking for like-minded individuals who also don't drink, because that can help build a new support system for you. Next, we have participate in sober activities and hobbies. This is where I learned that I really love kayaking. I also love running. I wrote a book and I loved school, and I was able to go back to school and get my AA and my bachelor's. So these are types of things that I never really participated in because of my energy and the focus being elsewhere. Another thing that led me to being 100% alcohol-free for almost 7 years is I started by taking breaks. I went 6 months, I'd go a couple months, I've even gone a year. And eventually in time, it just got easier and I hit that point where I was done. And I think some of that goes to taking those breaks, because it made that final one just much easier because I had done it before. And it's important to think about that, because I feel like when people relapse or go back, then they kind of stick with it versus trying again because they feel like it's a failure. It's not a failure. You're getting there. Just keep it up. Next is to acknowledge the link to mental health. Again, I never really thought about my mental health a whole lot until I started realizing the effect alcohol had on my mental health, and getting to that point where I really just desperately wanted to fix it. And lastly, therapy and again, support groups are important. Even just social media, I follow a lot of sober accounts and mental health related accounts, and more on a positive note to help keep my mindset in a better place versus, um, following some of those old accounts that might be a little toxic or triggering. Um, I want my feed to help me grow versus hold me back. So, and then again, therapy of whichever choice, and therapy may not be for everyone, but I always highly recommend at least looking into that, just because it's a way to challenge yourself, it's a way to grow, it's a way to find that awareness and kind of dig around. I've felt like it's important to bring up some celebrities who are sober. And these two, I think, are my favorite just because I love a lot of their movies, and The Silver Linings Playbook is one of my favorites. I love Brad Pitt. He's from Springfield, Missouri. So, um, and sometimes maybe people can relate or aspire to, um, celebrities. So I figured I'd bring them up in some quotes. First, we have Bradley Cooper, and his quote is, "If I continued it, I was really going to sabotage my whole life." And so what I love about Bradley Cooper and Brad Pitt is that they're both career oriented. They hustle, they create, and produce. And I'd like to think a lot of that is contributed or can give credit to not having alcohol in their lives. And I believe they also give credit to that as well. For example, Brad Pitt: "Quitting drinking is the best thing I ever did. It was the hardest challenge of my life, but it opened up a whole new world of clarity and happiness."